Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the design, fit, and isolation of the Dunu Falcon Pro. I love the design of the Falcon Pro. I love the polished stainless steel shell, the attention to detail with the logo etched around the outside and on the inside, the middle of the shell, I think is just super, super slick. The shape is really nice. And I just think overall aesthetically, it's just a very, very nice IEM. Again, in my opinion, as far as just overall build quality between the IEM, the cable, all of this stuff is class leading in my opinion for this price range. They always put their best at when it comes to design and just overall build quality, no matter what price range it is. And again, this comes in at $219. I think that is just excellent build quality and just design for that price. Now, as far as the fit and the isolation of the IEM, the fit is very good. These are pretty small, so they fit very comfortable in my ear. They have a nice, good, deep insertion, so that's not an issue. Now, isolation is not that great, but I don't think they were intending this to be an isolating IEM necessarily. I think that they were more focused on the sound, and my environment, my listening environment, typically is pretty quiet. So I don't necessarily need it to have really good isolation unless I'm going to be using these on stage with drums, which I have tried these on stage with drums, and the isolation is not very good. But again, they weren't intended for that use, but I still wanted to try it just to see how they sounded. But otherwise, again, everything else, the design, the fit, is very, very good. Okay, let's move on to the specifications. We'll start with the Q-Lock Light Modular Cable Connector System. That includes a 2.5, 3.5, and a 4.4 balanced connector. They're quite easy to remove and replace. There's a little arrow on each connector that aligns. You just align that with this arrow on the cable, and it very, very easy to remove and replace these connectors. Again, I just think that is something that has always kind of set Dunu apart. Their cables are class leading in my opinion. I felt that way about the Dunu SA6. The cable on the Zen is very, very nice. Their cables are just good. I love that about Dunu is no matter what the price point is, it seems like they always just kill it when it comes to quality and just innovative features. I love that. Now we'll go ahead and move on to the interchangeable nozzles. You've got 3 different types of nozzles here. It comes with the reference nozzle installed, but you can change it. You've got the transparency nozzles here, and then you also have atmospheric immersion. I will go over how each of these affect the sound when we go into the sound review. Now, as far as the IEMs themselves, these actually use the same driver technology that's found in the Dunu Zen, the Eclipse driver technology. Now, of course, the Dunu Zen is a $700 IEM, and this is a $220 IEM. So the difference being, I believe the material that they used for this dynamic driver, the base material is similar to what's used in other dynamic drivers. The difference is 2 things. They coat this with an amorphous diamond-like carbon coating, and this also has a fully independent suspension surround, which, again, that is not typical with dynamic drivers. What they're trying to achieve is a balance between speed, but also that dynamic punch that a dynamic driver provides. And again, so different types of driver technologies have different types of attributes. And so with a balanced armature driver, you're going to have a little more speed, a little more accuracy, but it's going to lack that thump. It's going to lack that impact that a dynamic driver has, and then vice versa. The dynamic driver is going to have that thump and that dynamic impact, but it's not going to quite have the speed. So with this technology, what they're trying to achieve is the best of both worlds: speed, good transients, attack, and also that dynamic thump, that air movement that only a dynamic driver can create. And so for them to try to take all of that research, all of that technology that they put into the Dunu Zen that they've been working on for so long, and again, $220, they tried to take everything they could and apply that to this IEM. So I think that is really, really cool. So we've talked about how great the cable is. We've talked about how great the design is and the fit is, and all the different innovative features that they've included. So how is the sound? Because that's really what is important, right? All right, well, let's go ahead and talk about that. Now, the overall sound signature of the Dunu Falcon Pro is a warm, mild V shape. So you've got an emphasis on treble, recessed mids, and then an emphasis on mid bass and bass. Probably the most emphasis is around the mid bass area. So when you look at the graph of the Dunu Falcon Pro, of course, each tuning nozzle graphs a little bit differently, but they all basically follow the same curve. Now, what you're gonna see is really good treble extension and good treble presence above 10K. You've got a peak at around 13K, another peak at around 9K, another peak at around 5K, and then it stays about the same all the way to 2K, then it starts to drop off. And where those mids start to recess, it bottoms out right at around 1K, then immediately jump right back up. Again, we've got a warm sound signature, so you've got the substantial elevation in the mid bass. So right at around 800 hertz, you see that start to jump back up, and then you've got pretty substantial presence beyond 800 hertz. And I think the graph, it kind of tops out in the bass right at around 100 hertz and then starts to roll off a little bit after that. So again, you've got that warm sound signature between 800 hertz and 100 hertz. There's, again, substantial presence there. And the only
mild dip, again, is right after 2K, between 2K and 800 hertz. We'll start with the transparency nozzle because that's kind of the one, even though it comes stock with the reference nozzle, which is pretty good, but I actually liked the transparency nozzle a little bit better. That was the one I listened to the most and kind of felt like that one gave me the most satisfaction in the upper treble area, because again, that upper treble, that's what's going to give you that air in live recordings. Not that the reference one was lacking necessarily, I just, again, I got a little more satisfaction out of the transparency nozzle, a little bit of a wider sound stage, not much, but again, it just seemed like it was just a little more upper treble presence, especially for live recordings. For me, that was something that I was kind of drawn to. Now, so you've got, again, a transparency nozzle. It still maintains that warm sound signature that I like. So all of these, no matter which nozzle you use, you're still going to have a pretty warm sound signature, again, because of that elevation in the lower mids and the mid bass. But the transparency is probably going to give you, well, it definitely is going to give you your most mid and treble presence. The second nozzle, which is the reference nozzle, again, that's the one that it comes stock with. So that's the one that's already installed on the IEM. So with the reference nozzle, again, you don't quite have as much air as you do on the transparency, and it just seems like the sound stage is a little narrower. And then of course it recesses right at the same point at the 1K in the mids, and again the bass and the lower mids, the mid bass and the bass pretty much follow the same curve. It starts to split off right at around, I believe at around 500 hertz, 400 hertz. Then when you move on to the atmospheric immersion nozzle, what that's going to do is give you the least amount of treble presence, definitely a more intimate kind of sound stage, so it's definitely not as wide. And you're still going to have that dip at 1K, and then really the most emphasis on the mid bass and bass. So again, of the three, my personal favorite was the transparency nozzle, but I did like the reference as well. I thought that one was pretty good. I didn't use the atmospheric immersion nozzle that much because I felt satisfied with the amount of bass presence that was still there with the other two nozzles. So I tended to kind of gravitate towards the transparency nozzle the most. Okay, now if you look at the treble on the graph, again, between the three different nozzles, what you're gonna see is the most treble presence in the transparency nozzle, a little less in the reference nozzle, and then a substantially less amount in the atmospheric immersion nozzle. Between the reference and the transparency nozzle, you're going to have the most upper treble presence. Again, both of them gave me a pretty decent amount of air, with the transparency giving me that the most satisfaction in live recordings. And again, we talked about detail retrieval, and I talked about me being a drummer and how I like to hear those details in the cymbals. And I've talked about Jazz at the Pawn Shop. That's the one I use that track a lot because that track has really good detail, and there's you can hear all of those frequencies traveling through the metal of the cymbals and the hi-hat. And you can, if you have a really resolving IEM, it should be able to pull all those details out of those cymbals. And it seemed like the transparency nozzle just seemed to do that the best for me. And again, live recordings, you're gonna have that air and that atmosphere. That's gonna be everything above 10K. So if you've got an IEM that has good treble extension, that's gonna give you a lot of satisfaction. You're gonna really be able to sense that air, and which for me, that helps me to kind of immerse myself more into the recording. So that upper treble region with the transparency nozzle, that's going to give you the best overall, for me, experience with live recordings. And I listen to a lot of those. Now, I would say the reference nozzle of the three is probably, it's going to give, if someone is maybe a little bit treble sensitive, maybe that reference nozzle might be a good balance between the atmospheric immersion and the transparency, because it's just a little more relaxed. But again, you still have enough air and upper treble presence to satisfy, and even good detail retrieval. Now, the atmospheric immersion, that one has, like I said, a substantial drop in the upper treble region. For me, there just wasn't enough air. As a matter of fact, it's substantially, even in the lower treble and upper mids, there's quite a bit of a difference. Probably, I think it kind of varies. In the upper treble, it's about a 5 to 6 dBs less, and then as you get down towards the lower treble, upper mids, there's maybe a 3 to 6 dB difference or less presence in the lower treble, upper mids. And it's not till around maybe 2K where they start to kind of get closer. So again, that's why you have, with that atmospheric immersion nozzle, so much mid-bass and bass presence, because they've got that treble and the upper mids and the lower treble and upper treble recessed substantially. So again, of the three nozzles, as far as the treble presentation and again the detail, I just seemed like I liked the treble presentation the best on the transparency nozzle. Okay, let's talk about the mids. Okay, now moving out of the lower treble into the upper mids, again, you're gonna see that little bump at 5K, and it stays about the same all the way to 2K, then after 2K it drops off. Now, the transparency nozzle and the reference nozzle, they follow a pretty similar path right there between 5 and 2K. But the reference nozzle, after 5K, it starts to dip a little bit. And so by the time you get to that 2K point, there is a little bit of a deviation between the reference and the transparency nozzle, with a little bit less 2K presence in the reference nozzle. And the atmospheric immersion nozzle, you're gonna see the least amount of presence in that 5 to 2K. So for me, what it did, I think that 2K, it seemed like it just pushed some higher female vocals forward, some of the higher piano notes a little more forward. So it just seemed like some of the instruments that have some of those higher frequencies, snare attack, the stick attack on the toms, it seemed like there was just a little more presence right there, a little more stick attack on snares and toms. And again, those higher piano notes. Now, again, but once you get past that 2K, everything pretty much meets back up and bottoms out right at around 1K. Now, and again, you have that 1K dip, and since it's a mild V shape, again, we talked about this typical V shape, it seems like it'll push instruments and vocals, can tend to push them a little too far back. But I didn't notice that with this, again, because it's just a minor drop in that 1K area. And then it jumps right back up after, that 1K, it starts to go back up, and you have that lower mid presence there, again, that lends itself to that warm kind of sound signature. So that lower mid presence, again, that's pretty much very present in all three different nozzles. But it seems like it's the most elevated in the atmospheric immersion nozzle, because again, you have way less treble presence in the atmospheric immersion nozzle. So again, all three of them, because of that the elevated lower mids, they're all going to have that warm kind of presentation. Okay, so moving out of the lower mids into the mid bass, you start to see an increase. Again, starting at 800 hertz, you start to see that increase in the lower mids all the way into the mid bass. And it kind of tops out right at around 100 hertz and then starts to roll off into the sub bass. There is still an adequate amount of sub bass presence. However, the emphasis is definitely on the mid bass. Now, and I want to talk about that frequency range between about 500 hertz and 200 hertz. Because right there, you got to be careful with your tuning, because you don't want to have bass bleeding into the lower mids, because that can tend to kind of muddy things up, and it can start to sound a little lacking as far as in texture and detail. You want to make sure you don't have too much bass bleeding into the lower mids. but you still want to be able to maintain that thump and that impact. Now, I remember watching an interview with Tom from Dunu, and he was talking about the driver that, because the Dunu Falcon Pro it has an Eclipse driver. It's the most affordable IEM that they have that still uses the Eclipse driver technology, but it is what they did is they used, I think the base material they used for the driver is a polymer, and then they coat it with a diamond-like carbon coating. So it gives it that rigidity and that stiffness. So this is still, this is Eclipse driver technology. Now remember, they've been working on this technology for a long time and developing it. And now you can get that technology at $220. So that is really, really cool that they went to that extent trying to make it reachable and attainable for people who are on a budget. I love that. And you definitely get the benefits of that Eclipse driver technology in the Dunu Falcon Pro. And again, the first thing I noticed when I put these in my ears, of course it came with the reference nozzle, but I noticed that mid-bass kick drum thump right away. And again, you still have an adequate amount of sub-bass presence. So you still have that low rumble of the sub-bass, but you also have this really impressive thump and impact from kick drums, and again, going back to being careful about the bass bleeding into the lower mids, because when that happens, you can lose the texture. This has adequate texture, adequate detail. So I was listening to a track, Tingval Trio. I don't remember the track, but he was playing an upright bass, and you could hear just all the details of the plucks when he was plucking those strings on the upright bass. You could almost hear the finger kind of going across the string. Just really, really good detail retrieval and texture in the lower mids and mid bass. There's also a song by Go-Go Penguin. It's actually off of their remix album. The song is called Cora, and it's the Cornelius remix. There's texture and kind of detail and an effect on the bass that just, it kind of has a few different textures kind of and layerings going on with his bass tone. It just sounds really, really cool. And some IEMs that I have can retrieve that detail, and some of them can't retrieve it that well. As a matter of fact, I just kind of am reminiscing, thinking about when I had the Odin, that thing just sucked all that detail out of those lower mids and mid bass in that song, the Cora track. And I was just super, super impressed with that. And then on my OG Campfire Solarises, it seems like those don't quite do as good of a job. It's like it's missing a little bit of that detail right there. So that is something, I use that song a lot because if I want to see how much lower mids and mid bass detail and texture an IEM can pull out, I'll use that track. And that track is the one I use for these. And this thing was able to really pull a lot of that detail and texture out. And just really, really impressed me. So the bass on this, while it is, again, mid-bass forward, it may not be for everybody. I liked it. I liked hearing that mid-bass thump. And again, it was still able to maintain a good amount of detail, a good amount of texture, and still have that sub-bass rumble. Okay, so just to kind of summarize, let's just kind of recap what you get for $220. First of all, you get the Eclipse driver technology that was, again, only available in their higher-end Zen IEM before. Now, for $220, you can get their Eclipse driver technology. Plus, you have 3 different tuning nozzles. You've got the transparency, atmospheric immersion, and the reference nozzle. So you've got 3 different tuning options. Plus, you get the Q-Lock Lite modular cable system. So 3.5 millimeter connector, 2.5, and a 4.4 connector. And even if it only was a 3.5, that's still a great cable. You have a great design, very comfortable IEM. So overall, yes, I would say this is a very solid package for the $220 price range. I think that Dunu hit it out of the park with the Dunu Falcon Pro. I love this IEM. So I just want to say thanks to all my viewers, to all of my subscribers. Please like this video. Please share this video. Have an awesome day.